And finally, we have Alan Ward. Alan is a landscape architect and urban designer with over 30 years of experience at Sasaki. His recent work, currently under construction, includes the design of new security features integrated into the landscape of the Lincoln Memorial and Reflecting Pool in Washington, D.C. Alan will discuss a landscape architect's perspective on security. There's a long history of utilizing these spaces beyond the building's edges to provide defense from a variety of threats, and Alan will highlight how this tradition is being blended with new ideas to provide effective security at some of our nation's most cherished monuments and public spaces. So we expect to have a very engaging public discussion tonight, and we hope you'll learn a lot from this set of presentations.
Well, my interest as a landscape architect is how we can integrate these elements of security into our public realm and still express who we are in our public environment. Because if you look at the history of American planning and urban design, our public environment is an expression of openness, accessibility. So to me, it's rather frightening, the prospects of having to integrate so many degrees of security into the public environment. Now, there are historic precedents that are useful, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those historic precedents, but it still requires, I think, careful design to effectively integrate these precedents into the contemporary environment, especially with respect to historic, culturally significant open spaces and landscapes, and in particular in the urban context. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about these opportunities because I think we tend not to value the improvements in our public realm as highly as we should, and these are opportunities with a combination of a security concern, these very real threats that Brian described, to also enhance our public realm. And there are some very interesting case studies, the Washington Monument, for example, where a security imperative led to significant improvements to the kind of experience of the monument itself. So what can be learned from designs of the past? The history of landscape design will tell you from the beginning there were concerns beginning with shaping the earth to create a defensive space here at Avebury, shaping the earth around this settlement. The sunken wall dates from perhaps the 18th century when English landscape designers created these barriers and still allowed openness and visibility across the landscape. These are, of course, tactics that are employed in some of the more interesting contemporary designs. Even in a more urban context, significant sites, by virtue of these sunken walls, can be relatively invisible from one side and be integrated into the landscape composition. Of course, moats with water or without are kind of a traditional method. And some of the most interesting entries, gateways to parks, public spaces, have been beautifully designed gates. Now, we don't necessarily have this tradition of having private royal spaces like in London and England, but these gates are kind of a long tradition of defining an entry to public space. The great American rural cemeteries have these beautiful gates that kind of mark kind of a separate zone. Even these elements of security are embedded in our landscape traditions. The bulwark, the origins of the word boulevard comes from these bulwarks that were around the cities. This is Vienna, which was, of course, the bulwarks were removed to create the great boulevards. So can you apply these, and what is our distinctive kind of expression of American public space? And I would argue that it's one that is far more open than we see in those European precedents. This is Olmsted's design for the Capitol grounds. It had about 20 to 21 streets and paths that entered the Capitol grounds. So a phenomenal degree of openness and accessibility was part of this original design that he felt was appropriate for an expression of what we were as a democracy. Even in small town America, the courthouse square, accessible from all directions, at the very center of community. It's hard to imagine how barriers effectively can kind of work with such a kind of expression of openness. Even in planning larger municipal groups here in Cleveland, the courthouse is a key part of framing public open spaces in an open and accessible way. So when did our ideas change with respect to this kind of degree of openness? And when did these kind of symbols become less open and become more, you might say, targets in kind of Brian's language. It really wasn't 9/11, it was the Oklahoma City bombing, which kind of fundamentally shifted the perception of a place. Here you see the Lincoln Memorial. Before that time, presumably you could drive around this. Originally, certainly the original design allowed driving all the way around it, open, accessible to all. So what are some successful precedents in recent design efforts? In 2003, with the design competition for the Washington Monument, 5 or 6 talented designers were shortlisted for this competition. This is one of the entrants, Michael von Volkenberg, who created a scheme that used one of those time-tested methods, water combined with walls around the monument, an interesting use of those historic precedents. He called them time-tested security elements. But importantly, it was an opportunity to do these other things that we would also do if we were redesigning this open space to enhance it for everyone's use, and that's improve the experience of history, acknowledge the natural history, and so forth. So the opportunity was seized in this scheme to create other improvements, but motivated by, of course, a security concern. The winning scheme by Laurie Olin also had those same aspirations. It was simpler solution, the sunken walls around the monument, clarifying circulation. But importantly, it was understood with a keen appreciation for the topography of the monument, so that it becomes almost a base around this elevated condition, the hill that the monument was sited on. So it seems like a very logical expression of a way to express the monument on this larger base. It's much like Olmsted's work on the West Terraces, which was a logical expression of making a base around the Capitol on the west side, and just feels right and appropriate. The wall itself also has, other kind of opportunities for use. It becomes carefully calculated for seat height. And it's not a small matter because you have ADA requirements in terms of people falling off the edge, so that you have this curb at the bottom to reduce that height. You have a warning strip in the back. So it was a carefully crafted design that I think most people look at as a positive contribution to the experience of the monument. These are the conditions we face, which are always challenging. That's where the interface with circulation through the barrier and what happens with the bollards. So here was Olin's expression. He acknowledges borrowing from the past, from these 18th century precedents that were used in country houses. It was entered as a design award in 2008. The jury gave a very interesting summary of why this scheme has been so successful. Bold and clear, a minimalist solution. I think that's our aim in all of these efforts, is to make a minimalist solution. But the funding turned that project, one that prevented just terrorism, but also into a handsome civic amenity. This was not really part of the security scheme. This was the opportunity then to use that funding to make a great civic gathering space around the base of the monument. Now, the Capitol Visitor Center. The Capitol was originally conceived quite open and accessible, as I mentioned earlier. This is just after the installation of the Olmsted Plan of 1893, and his original plan with these 21 or so paths entering the grounds itself. I love the biography of Jefferson, where the story is that he rode his horse right up to the Capitol, gave his second inauguration. It was open to all. But by late in the 20th century, you had this condition. Paths were carefully defined, of course, ubiquitous planters as vehicular barriers. Presumably circulation is restricted here to keep people from moving all about, or to protect them from congressmen driving on the plaza, perhaps. But there were these, as part of the process, we worked with the RTKL team as landscape architects. We identified, working with a historian, what the key zones were, the most significant cultural landscapes. And there were zones for preservation, the ovals, rehabilitation, where you could accommodate some changes in the plaza, and then these intervening areas were identified as zones for new construction. They were less character defining than the more culturally significant areas you see in the oval and the plaza. So that became a zone to enter the visitor center and provide security for all those who are entering. The plan of the Olmsted scheme and the new scheme for the visitor center looked quite similar when viewed from above, but a fundamental shift has occurred. Instead of entering this building based on the classical Greek and Roman precedents of going up the flight of stairs, you now enter down 18 feet. So we've made a huge shift in terms of the kind of basic expression of how that building was meant to be entered. And I think it's a question to grapple with in terms of making these underground entries, whether it's appropriate to do that. It is a design challenge. Here you make this break between going to the plaza level or descending down. Everyone who enters has to descend down into this most important building to Americans. So you get these kinds of expressions. We did our best to incorporate trees along that path, but still it's descending 18 feet. How many great buildings in kind of the history of architecture are entered at such a low grade, other than funerary structures? So you get these kind of conditions where you have significant stairs. Walls, in the original Olmsted plan, walls were 2 or 3 feet high as a means to kind of guide people along. This wall is about 18 feet on the right here. The Lincoln Memorial, this is a more recent effort. These were bollards that were put in as an idea of kind of a permanent solution, and then there were temporary bollards on the axis from the memorial to the Washington Monument. So the design solution had to address that, create a zone of security, but it provided opportunities for other enhancements here, significant other enhancements. But what's challenging in these kind of environments, if you look at what influenced the plan for Washington, the Macmillan plan, were French precedents. The French garden, which is very flat, is very horizontal. It's like a landscape stretched over a very flat surface with some subtle grading. So how do you integrate walls and barriers into this kind of open, flat, kind of expansive landscape? This is the scheme that, fortunately, at this zone here, there was a change of topography where the grading along each side of the elm walks and the reflecting pool meet this transition zone up. So there was an opportunity here to integrate in kind of a hybrid sort of way multiple security elements. So overlaid on that is a combination of bollards you see on the top here, site retaining walls around a new ADA accessibility route, a low wall where the grade transitions, and then actually deepening the pool itself to be a completion of this kind of integrated ring of security at the Lincoln Memorial, which is now under construction. So when you look at this view, it looks like a series of improvements to that landscape in terms of making an accessible route from above. That's a curving path you see here on the left, but integrated with that is a wall. A low wall here at the end of this path, and this is a new path on what is kind of open, muddy turf many days. So in this line of security is the pool itself you see on the right, the bollards, this low wall, and then this wall with the ramp on the left. So an attempt with a whole series of elements that are connected to almost make it disappear, to make it look like there was no new design here, but just upgrades to the site itself. Inevitably, when these paths cross the vehicular barriers, you still get bollards, unfortunately. But you see on the left here, the wall is graded into the site to kind of disappear. This is then the result, a new path along the edges, and then these new improvements on each side of the memorial. Now, a tougher problem are streets and urban streets in a tighter context. What do you do? This was a study done for 12th Street and Franklin Circle in the middle of the Federal Triangle. It was only limited to that street and the hemicycle. An interesting condition, you have EPA on one side, IRS on the other. At one point, the buildings, the pavilions at the end of the hemicycle are about 3 feet from the street. So very close. Then you have a wider plaza in the hemicycle itself. The criteria was make the barrier as far away from the buildings as possible, which was odd in that at one point, the threat was only 3 feet away. So the plan that was developed incorporates planters on 12th Street, you see on the right here, going south. And this, of course, is a key entry to the city. A fountain and a fountain edge in the middle of the hemicycle, And then some adjustments to the traffic lanes to get a little more space where these pavilions kind of neck down at the street. So it meant working with city and traffic to condense the traffic lanes, eliminate the parking, and gain about 10 feet or so here where the building is actually so close to the vehicular way. So it's taking that section below there, converting it to just 4 lanes. But what is odd to me is that the criteria still demanded that the perimeter barrier be all the way out to the street at the space of the hemicycle. So here you have 80 feet in one place and then just a few feet in another condition. It almost seemed like an irrational set of criteria. But coupled with that idea, this was never implemented, but there was a chance to greatly improve this space, which desperately needs it. An idea to make it, since the EPA is right here, to make it almost a closed loop in terms of how water is used for this fountain. All the water that falls on it is recycled into the fountain or irrigation. So there was a chance to do more, once again, motivated by a security imperative. Okay, other examples which I think are worth discussing and are less successful here at the IMF, the security around this one building it's almost like a catalog of types of benches, light fixtures, and so forth. And it's hard to imagine this repeated. In fact, even on one block, it is a startling amount of elements on the street itself. And I think bollards are, to me, the problem is not a bollard in itself, it's the repetition of bollards. So once again, you know, a simple sidewalk or streetscape with a few bollards may not be a problem, along with light fixtures and so forth, but it's the repetition of these bollards that you see so often that becomes such a problem in terms of creating a simple expression along sidewalks. Pennsylvania Avenue, to me, as part of the larger strategy, I think this was covered by Tom earlier, but clearly a larger context for solving these problems makes a lot of sense, extending all the way to Lafayette Park. The ellipse, I hesitate to comment on this because we were an unsuccessful entrant in this competition. The ellipse was a challenging problem. It is a descendant from that idea of the French landscape extended kind of over this very large area. So it posed particular problems, and I was surprised that the winning solution actually raised the elevation and created a wall around the entire ellipse. You know, this was meant to be a flat landscape with relative openness to the spaces beyond. So to me, it was the security imperative outweighed the considerations of the cultural significance of this landscape. So I'll leave you with a few questions that were raised by this presentation. Are the security requirements appropriately defined? Sometimes they seem to be, like for example at Franklin Circle, unevenly defined. Are the historical precedents being used appropriately, especially at culturally significant sites? You know, you can't simply add these walls. It has to be integrated with an understanding of the original design intention of these sites and with respect to the topography and grading intentions. Are historical precedents of the site security more relevant in more urban conditions along sidewalks? I think not. These solutions are mainly for larger landscape settings, particularly applicable, for example, our embassy program. We're working on 3 embassies where you have setbacks that you can integrate these landscape precedents into them. And this, of course, was raised by Tom, that should there be security design for individual buildings or a more district-wide approach? So with that, we'll open it up to questions, right? Or you're going to raise questions. Okay.